What happens when royalty meets ridiculous? Not scandal, not treason, just pure jaw-dropping idiocy. From kings who talked to trees to queens who trained mice for tea, these aren't history's masterminds. They're its majestic messes. Forget politics. This is about corsets too tight to breathe, trousers that self-destruct, and one prince who tried to roast chestnuts in his coat. These are the 25 biggest idiots in British royal history, ranked, ridiculed, and royally unqualified for common sense. You thought royalty was all power and poise? Think again. Let the parade of regal foolishness begin. Before we dive headfirst into royal absurdity, take a second to subscribe, unless of course you're busy fitting into a corset 3 sizes too small. And while you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Texas? We're curious who else is wide awake listening to monarchs make fools of themselves. 1. George IV. George IV liked to think of himself as a sculpture, something marble, heroic, and vaguely Grecian. So he spent most of his adult life trying to compress his very unmarble-like body into a corset designed for someone who didn't exist. He cinched it tighter every year, tighter at formal dinners, tighter during state councils, tighter even when he tried to ride a horse, which usually ended with the horse giving him a look that said absolutely not. He fainted a lot, dramatically, spectacularly, usually right onto something expensive. At one dinner he passed out so soundlessly that guests assumed he was simply contemplating the gravy. It wasn't until a footman tried to refill his wine and noticed the king was sliding sideways like a felled tree that anyone realized he wasn't meditating. He was unconscious. Again. His spending habits weren't much better. George decorated homes like a man who'd never been told, "No, stop," or "Your Majesty, that wall cannot structurally support 6 tons of gold leaf." He collected chandeliers the way bored children collect rocks. Except children don't commission Italian artisans to carve the rocks into cherubs for £5,000 a cherub. Even his bed was a monument, an absurd mechanical contraption topped with feathers, mirrors, and a level of detail that suggested he believed heaven had a velvet upholstery budget. And yet the funniest thing about George IV wasn't the corsets or the fainting or the decor so gaudy it could blind innocent bystanders. It was how sincerely he believed all of it made him look dignified. In his mind, collapsing unconscious into a candelabrum was simply the price of beauty. But if George was the king of self-inflicted chaos, the royal who followed him perfected a very different art, losing track of absolutely everything, including things a monarch probably shouldn't misplace at all. 2. Queen Anne. Queen Anne had one of the most powerful titles on earth, and the organizational skills of a distracted pigeon. It wasn't just that she lost things, it was how often, how completely, and how bewilderingly she managed to misplace objects that were literally stitched to her life as monarch. Letters from generals? Gone. Gowns made specifically for state appearances? Vanished. Jewelry of national significance? Temporarily unfound, usually until a servant found it under a chair cushion or in the fireplace poker drawer. She once lost a coronation gift, forgot she'd been given it, and then accused her lady-in-waiting of theft. The woman was nearly dismissed before the item was discovered inside one of Anne's own riding boots, where she had apparently stuffed it for safekeeping. This happened more than once. Not the riding boot specifically, but the general concept. Blame first, fine later, apologize never. Anne also developed a paranoid streak about her servants. Not because they were disloyal, but because she couldn't fathom the idea that she herself might be the reason for the disappearing objects. If you had told her a ghost had taken her ceremonial wig, she'd believe that before admitting she'd left it on her balcony during breakfast. There's something almost tragic about it. A woman surrounded by power, influence, and royal protocol, and yet never quite sure where she put her own letters, or tiaras, or occasionally her temper. Still, Even Queen Anne's habits pale in comparison to the next royal on our list. A woman whose worst mistake wasn't losing an object, but sending something she never should have written in the first place. If you've made it this far, past fainting kings and queens who can't keep track of their own clothes, you're clearly one of us. So go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. And while Queen Anne's losing her letters, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Middle of the night, lunch break, hiding from your boss in the bathroom? We won't judge. 3. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, had a flair for romance, rebellion, and writing things down that absolutely should never have been written. At a time when treason could be declared over an overheard whisper, Mary opted to put her most compromising thoughts in writing, and then send them unsealed, as if 16th century couriers had a strict privacy policy and a moral code. They did not. The infamous love letters to the Earl of Bothwell weren't just emotionally reckless, they were strategically suicidal. She poured her heart into them with all the subtlety of a thunderstorm. Love declarations, hints of conspiracy, emotional spirals. All of it carefully penned in her own hand and then, bizarrely, handed off like a birthday card to be passed around the kingdom. Sealing them with wax? Apparently too much effort. At one point, one of the letters passed through multiple hands, none of them sympathetic, before ever reaching its intended target. The result? Political catastrophe. Even her allies were baffled. Why would she write that? Became the unofficial diplomatic slogan of Mary's later reign. It was less a matter of betrayal and more a matter of astonishing lack of discretion. Queens were supposed to plot in whispers, not scrolls. And yet perhaps the strangest part was that she kept doing it. As if every intercepted letter wasn't a warning, but a fluke. Or worse, as if fate itself had become her personal mailman. But where Mary trusted too easily in people, the next monarch trusted in something far more irrational, his own battle against invisible winds and witches. 4. King James I, 6th of Scotland. King James I was not just the man who commissioned the King James Bible. He was also the man who sincerely believed that malevolent old women could summon storms with bad vibes and ruin his marriage with a broomstick. His fear of witches wasn't symbolic or ceremonial. It was personal, specific, and obsessive. After a particularly stormy voyage back from Denmark, James became convinced that witches had stirred up the North Sea just to target him. Not because of politics or revenge. No, just because he'd recently gotten married and they didn't like it. From then on, he treated witchcraft like other kings treated war or taxes, with strategy, fervor, and a questionable grasp on reality. At night, he slept with charms sewn into his shirts. During the day, he wore protective amulets made of nonsense herbs and goat bones, confident that these trinkets kept magic winds at bay. He once interrogated a woman accused of sorcery for so long that she confessed to flying through chimneys, purely to make him stop asking questions. He believed her. He even wrote a book about it. Demonology, a semi-coherent treatise that claimed witches could steal men's virility and summon tempests by boiling cats. All of this from the same man who sponsored one of the most influential literary projects in history, a king who gave the world scripture, while simultaneously chasing imaginary broomsticks through the royal bedchamber. Still, if James was haunted by imaginary forces, the next king had a more earthly fear, that someone might not recognize him, especially when he jumped out of the bushes dressed as a commoner. 5. King Henry VIII. Henry VIII was a man of contradictions, a tyrant with a lute, a theologian with 6 wives, and, in his stranger moments, a king who thought surprise costumes were the height of royal amusement. He had a fondness for disguises, commoners, soldiers, servants, and an even greater fondness for jumping out at unsuspecting courtiers just to see the look on their faces. He once crashed a masquerade ball dressed as Robin Hood and demanded the guests guess who he was. despite being a 280-pound monarch with a voice like a thunderclap and a famously gouty gait. Everyone guessed immediately. They clapped anyway. But the pranks didn't stop at parties. Henry occasionally roamed the castle in peasant garb, sneaking up on his own guards to test their alertness. That is, until one particularly overzealous courtier nearly ran him through with a sword, convinced a lunatic had breached palace security. The king reportedly found it hilarious. Everyone else did not. This strange need to be both feared and unrecognizable reveals something deeply absurd. A man who demanded everyone tremble at his name, while also craving the thrill of not being recognized. Power, it seems, wasn't enough. Henry wanted the joy of catching his subjects off guard, even if it meant risking injury, or worse, embarrassment. And if Henry was a danger to himself in costume, the next royal took danger airborne, literally, by climbing into the cockpit of a plane he had no business flying. 6. Prince George, Duke of Kent. Prince George, Duke of Kent, had the rakish charm of a movie star and the decision-making skills of a man who thought clouds were just suggestions. As the fourth son of King George V, he wasn't burdened with the weight of the crown, which left him with something far more dangerous: free time and a pilot's license. To be clear, Prince George was not trained to fly the way one ought to be when commanding a machine that can plummet from the sky. He simply liked it. The glamour, the thrill, the attention. He took to aviation the way most men take to weekend hobbies, except his involved poor judgment and high altitudes. He once insisted on flying in severe weather just to impress a group of friends, all of whom had the distinct look of people who'd rather be on the ground with a drink. It wasn't just about flying, it was how he flew. Fast, low, and with the kind of swagger that makes trained pilots quietly excuse themselves from the airfield. Mechanics who worked on his planes described him as confident to a fault, a phrase that's never followed by good news. His final flight ended tragically, in mysterious circumstances still debated today. But even before that, George had earned a reputation not just as a reckless aristocrat, but as someone who seemed vaguely surprised that the laws of physics applied to him. And if George tempted gravity, the next royal tried to train something far less cooperative, a palace mouse with tea-time manners. 7. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria ruled an empire on which the sun never set, yet she once spent an entire afternoon trying to teach a mouse proper table etiquette. Not a euphemism, a literal mouse. She reportedly discovered the tiny creature scurrying near the royal tea service and, rather than shriek or summon pest control, declared it her new companion. The plan? Train it to sit politely at tea. Servants, accustomed to all manner of regal eccentricity, were nonetheless baffled. They were instructed to provide crumbs at a designated saucer, not to move too quickly, and most importantly, not to upset Her Majesty's guest. The mouse, predictably, did not respond to these efforts with aristocratic restraint. Instead, it vanished into the drapes, reappeared in a breadbasket, and finally caused complete chaos when it launched itself across the table during a state tea, knocking over a cream jug and sending several dignitaries leaping from their chairs. After the incident, Victoria declared the training a failure, not because it was a fundamentally flawed idea, but because the mouse lacked discipline. She remained convinced that, with enough time, it might have learned to curtsy. The entire episode would have been written off as harmless whimsy if it weren't part of a larger pattern. A monarch whose private life often drifted into childlike fantasy, entirely disconnected from the real-world machinery of empire. But if Victoria's eccentricity involved rodents and rituals, her son had his own peculiar obsession, with trousers so tight they often turned dinner parties into slapstick farces. 8. Edward VII, when Prince of Wales. Before Edward VII ascended the throne, he was best known not for diplomacy or governance, but for his trousers, specifically for selecting trousers so impossibly tight they made sitting, dancing, or even breathing a logistical puzzle. Fashion, to Edward, was not about comfort. It was a performance, a spectacle of pressed seams and strained buttons, where circulation was optional, but appearances were non-negotiable. He had them tailored to within a thread of structural integrity. At balls, he strutted like a man encased in concrete, making exaggerated, careful steps to avoid catastrophic wardrobe failure. He didn't always succeed. One famous incident involved a sharp bow to a duchess that ended in an audible rip, followed by a retreat that can only be described as royal hobbling. Guests pretended not to notice. His valet, of course, had a replacement pair ready. It wasn't his first rodeo. The irony was rich. Edward was a man of large appetites and generous proportions, yet he insisted on garments better suited for a fencing instructor or a wax figure. Friends tried to persuade him to go looser, more forgiving. He refused. He believed tight trousers trained the posture, which they did, largely by limiting his ability to bend at the waist. Behind the polished mustache and excessive cologne was a man waging daily war against fabric, physics, and common sense. And yet, if Edward's vanity was stitched into his wardrobe, the next royal made her most regrettable decision on her skin, with a beauty routine that poisoned her face and reputation alike. 9. Princess Margaret. Princess Margaret lit her cigarettes like royalty cast spells, dramatically, publicly, and with no regard for the upholstery. She smoked constantly, not socially, not occasionally, but as a daily ritual that turned palaces into tinderboxes and drapery into flammable decor. She puffed through breakfast, cocktail hour, and long stretches of evening disdain. Staff learned to accept the occasional singed curtain as part of their job. Guests learned not to sit too close unless they were flame retardant. On one occasion, a chair caught fire mid-conversation. Margaret didn't flinch. She simply waved down a footman and asked for another drink. Her attitude was less reckless and more imperially indifferent. Fire, after all, was other people's problem. When informed that her smoking had nearly set the hem of her gown alight during a state event, she reportedly replied, "Then it was a dull event." The palace installed fire extinguishers. She called them unsightly. They installed more. It wasn't just cigarettes. It was her total commitment to doing as she pleased, regardless of the consequences or common sense. Her rooms were a haze of smoke and perfume, her mood as combustible as the furniture. But Margaret didn't care. She saw herself as untouchable, too royal to be reprimanded, too glamorous to burn. And while Margaret lit rooms with nicotine and sarcasm, the next monarch went even further, refusing not just fire but water itself, convinced that bathing, of all things, might actually kill her. 10. Elizabeth I. Elizabeth, if you didn't fear assassins, mutinies, or the Spanish Armada, she feared soap and a proper rinse. Bathing, in her opinion, was an invitation to illness, and illness was a threat to the throne. So she avoided water the way modern royals avoid direct eye contact with tabloid photographers. The logic was medieval, but she clung to it with regal intensity. Water opened the pores, she believed, and through those pores came disease. Instead, Elizabeth turned to powders, perfumes, and an almost obsessive layering of cosmetics to present the illusion of pristine health. Chief among her tools was Venetian ceruse, a highly toxic blend of white lead and vinegar that she applied daily to maintain her ghost-pale complexion. When her skin began to flake and scar from prolonged exposure, she simply applied more. Cover the cracks, paint over the rot. Her entire beauty routine was a metaphor for monarchy. By middle age, her skin was ravaged, her teeth blackened, and her wig line increasingly obvious. But none of this could be acknowledged. Mirrors were removed. Portraits were idealized. Courtiers learned to speak in compliments or not at all. The Queen's physical reality was treated like a state secret. And yet, even with her deteriorating health and worsening complexion, Elizabeth remained the face of power. The illusion held, through sheer will and a lot of poisonous foundation. But while Elizabeth avoided water like it was plague incarnate, the next king had no such fears. In fact, he embraced the outdoors so enthusiastically that he once held a full-blown conversation with a tree, believing it to be a foreign monarch. 11. George III. George III has gone down in history for many things: losing the American colonies, developing a passion for agricultural reform, and most famously, experiencing mental breakdowns that baffled doctors and historians alike. But even in a lifetime full of oddities, few moments matched the day he walked into Windsor Great Park, approached a large tree, and began speaking to it as if it were Frederick the Great of Prussia. This wasn't poetic reflection or philosophical metaphor. It was a formal conversation. George bowed. He gestured. He spoke in full diplomatic tones, reportedly offering the tree military advice and asking after its family. Courtiers looked on in horror, unsure whether to interrupt or wait for the tree to reply. At the height of his episodes, George's eccentricities veered into surreal territory. He lectured birds. He wrote lengthy letters to no one. He believed himself to be dead at least once, and on another occasion claimed to have discovered secret messages in his own dinner. Doctors prescribed all manner of brutal treatments, some of which only worsened his condition, but none of them addressed the deeper absurdity of a king simultaneously ruling and unraveling in real time. Yet through all this, George remained stubbornly committed to his daily routines. He dressed with precision, he took his walks, and when he saw a tree that, in his mind, wore a Prussian uniform, he did what any proper monarch would do. He initiated polite conversation. But while George mistook trees for kings, the next royal preferred to gamble with something even more tangible: the furniture beneath him. 12. Prince Frederick, Duke of York. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, had a curious understanding of value. He wasn't much for saving money, budgeting, or even pretending to resist temptation. His favorite pastime? Gambling. Not discreet gentlemanly card games, but loud public reputation-tarnishing marathons of wagering that escalated to truly ludicrous heights. At first it was money, then jewelry, then horses. But the real turning point came when Frederick began betting items from his own home. Furniture, to be exact. Tables, chairs, occasionally entire sets. During one famously absurd evening, he reportedly lost a chaise longue, a dining table, and a set of silver candlesticks in 3 hands of cards. The winner had the items carted away that night, while Frederick barely blinked. Servants were frequently dispatched to retrieve backup furnishings from other royal residences, often under strict instruction not to tell his father, King George III, who, already holding conversations with trees, still might have noticed his son slowly emptying palaces one card game at a time. Frederick treated it all with a shrug. When asked if he regretted gambling away a particularly valuable writing desk, he reportedly said, "Not at all. It was a beast to write on." There was no strategy, no thrill of calculated risk, just an unshakable belief that, as a prince, nothing he lost truly stayed lost. Someone would always replace it, and they usually did. But while Frederick's folly involved chairs and candlesticks, the next royal brought the absurdity far closer to home by asking her staff to do something no servant should ever be asked: smell her armpits. 13. Queen Caroline of Brunswick. Queen Caroline of Brunswick was eccentric in a way that unsettled even the jaded aristocracy of Georgian England. Married to the famously disinterested George IV, who loathed her almost instantly, Caroline quickly became known less for royal grace and more for bewildering personal habits that left her household in a permanent state of confusion, discomfort, and mild fear. Foremost among these habits was her conviction that personal hygiene could be gauged through the noses of others. Caroline, it seems, did not trust her own senses when it came to body odor. Instead, she had a favored ritual: summoning servants and instructing them, sometimes mid-conversation, to lean in and smell her armpits. Their task? Determine whether she needed a wash. Not a full bath, mind you, just a wipe down in the event of olfactory emergency. There are at least 3 documented instances of this happening in front of guests. In one case, a visiting nobleman was so rattled by the scene that he excused himself early, citing spiritual distress. The queen appeared unfazed. To her, this was simply good hygiene management. If anything, she thought it showed an admirable practicality. Why risk overwashing when your footman could perform a quick diagnostic sniff? Caroline's disregard for decorum extended beyond cleanliness. She once kept a goat in her chambers. She wore dresses backward on occasion. Yet it was the armpit assessments that left the deepest impression on her bewildered staff. And if Caroline turned her body into a public mystery, the next monarch preferred to turn royal dinners into a petting zoo by letting his dogs dine directly from guests' plates. 14. Charles II. Charles II, the so-called Merry Monarch, returned from exile with a flair for indulgence and a court that resembled less a seat of power and more a three-ring circus with wigs. Known for his charm and libertinism, he presided over one of the most extravagant and chaotic royal households in English history. But among his many eccentricities, mistresses, banquets, powdered wigs, it was his deep, almost spiritual affection for his dogs that turned royal dining into an exercise in awkward diplomacy. Charles adored his spaniels, not in the metaphorical he liked having them around sense, but in the very literal they had free reign of the palace, the dinner table, and sometimes guests' laps kind of way. His beloved dogs were often present at meals, not lounging nearby but actively circling the table, occasionally leaping into laps or climbing onto chairs to get a better view of the roast. More than once, a foreign dignitary reached for his plate only to find a royal spaniel already licking it clean. Charles would chuckle and say something like, "He's got good taste," and the court would laugh, very carefully, because to criticize the dogs was to criticize the king. Servants tried placing dishes under silver domes. The dogs learned to knock them off. One footman once attempted to gently remove a spaniel from the table and was reassigned to an estate in Yorkshire by the week's end. Charles didn't care. To him, dogs were better than courtiers, loyal, silent, and uninterested in plotting. And while Charles let his pets rule the palace, the next royal took personal risk to a baffling extreme, by voluntarily eating poison, just to see what would happen. 15. Richard I, the Lionheart. Richard Burt is often remembered as the heroic warrior king who led crusades, battled Saladin, and inspired centuries of legend. But behind the chainmail and battlefield glory lived a man with a strangely cavalier attitude toward his own survival, particularly when it came to food. Among his less celebrated decisions, voluntarily eating poisonous mushrooms to test his endurance. This was not a one-time lapse in judgment. According to chroniclers, Richard believed physical toughness extended beyond combat, into diet, digestion, and whatever culinary roulette nature had to offer. On one occasion, while traveling through the French countryside, he allegedly insisted on sampling wild mushrooms that local guides warned were toxic. Richard shrugged, took a bite, and waited to see what would happen. What happened was predictable. Days of violent illness that left his retinue scrambling, and his physicians swearing oaths of disbelief. And yet, once recovered, he laughed it off as a noble experiment. "I wanted to know what I could withstand," he reportedly said, an attitude that might make sense on the battlefield, but less so at the dinner table. Richard's court grew used to his recklessness. He raced horses into forests, challenged people to duels on a whim, and treated illness like an enemy to be outstared. Poisonous mushrooms were just part of the brand. In a strange way, it fit. He saw himself as indestructible, a man above ordinary threats. But while Richard tempted death through ingestion, the next king took a much quieter route to absurdity, spending entire afternoons giving names to every single animal, and sometimes objects, in his royal vicinity. 16. Henry VI. Henry VI was not known for strength, charisma, or decisiveness. In fact, he was not really known at all in the traditional sense of monarchs leaving a strong impression. What he was known for, though, was an obsession so peculiar it bordered on surreal. Naming things. All the things. Horses, sheep, dogs, birds, trees, chairs, spoons. He could spend hours in the royal gardens naming every lamb in sight, and if you interrupted him, he'd start over. It wasn't eccentricity for amusement. This was genuine, painstaking cataloging. A robin might be Sir Robert Featherton. A goose, Lady Hiss of Devon. One servant claimed Henry once spent nearly an hour deliberating whether a black and white cat should be called Archbishop Whiskers or Lord Monochrome. He eventually chose both. Court life slowed dramatically when Henry was in one of his naming moods. Foreign dignitaries would wait in full regalia while the king conferred with a goose. Officials trying to discuss national finances were waved off because the king had spotted a pigeon he hadn't christened yet. One page noted that Henry seemed convinced the animals were awaiting their titles with anxious dignity. It was whimsical but also sad. The kingdom was fracturing, and its ruler was busy bestowing knighthood upon livestock. It was as if, in the absence of political control, Henry found solace in giving order to the only things that couldn't argue with him. And while Henry named the birds and beasts, the next monarch clung tightly to just one item, a single ragged handkerchief she refused to part with, no matter how ruined it became. 17. Mary I of England. Mary was often remembered for her grim sobriquet Bloody Mary, also harbored a far more mundane, yet deeply peculiar personal attachment. A single, battered handkerchief. It was no royal heirloom, no embroidered token from a foreign prince. Just a simple, aging square of cloth that, by all accounts, she carried with her for years, refusing to replace or retire it, even as it disintegrated into something barely recognizable as fabric. Her attendants offered newer, finer alternatives: silk from Italy, linen from Flanders, embroidered cotton from the finest English looms. She refused them all. That old handkerchief, threadbare and stained, held some inscrutable significance. She folded it neatly each night. She brought it to prayer. At state events, it could sometimes be seen tucked into her sleeve, frayed, yellowing, and utterly out of place beside jeweled rings and stiff Tudor collars. Some historians speculate it was a gift from her mother, Catherine of Aragon. Others think it became a talisman of sorts, a comfort in a life filled with rejection, political strife, and public hostility. But whatever its origin, the fixation bordered on the obsessive. She once scolded a lady-in-waiting simply for touching it without permission, and there are accounts of her weeping when it went missing, briefly, during a palace move. To cling so tightly to such a tattered object was more than sentiment. It was defiance. In a world where everything, thrones, marriages, faith, could be taken, this she could keep. But if Mary's obsession was silent and sorrowful, the next king's was brisk, loud, and bizarrely punctual. So committed to routine that he once started dinner without the Queen simply because the clock said it was time. 18. George V. George V ruled during a time of seismic change, world wars, collapsing empires, the death of old-world aristocracy. Yet despite the chaos around him, or perhaps because of it, he clung to routine with the intensity of a man trying to hold the world in place by sheer punctuality. To George, time was sacred, ritual was law, and dinner, above all else, began at precisely 8:00 p.m. No exceptions, not even for the Queen. On one now legendary evening, Queen Mary found herself delayed by just a few minutes. George, seated at the head of the table with his napkin folded and watch laid precisely beside his plate, did not hesitate. He rang the bell. Soup was served. The Queen entered mid-course to find her husband halfway through the consommé, refusing even to pause. His explanation was simple. She was late. This wasn't a one-off. George's obsession with schedule extended to every part of daily life. Breakfast at 8:30 sharp, letters answered in exact order of receipt, shoelaces tied in identical loops, He would time his walks, and if a dog slowed him down, it was returned to the kennels for inconsistency. He wasn't cruel, just unshakably committed to a kind of clockwork monarchy where precision substituted for charisma. In an age of rebellion and reinvention, George sought comfort in the tick of the second hand. But while George ruled by time, the next royal ruled by pain, self-inflicted, foot-based pain, all for the sake of elegance, even if it meant hobbling through palaces in shoes 2 sizes too small. 19. Queen Alexandra, wife of Edward VII. Queen Alexandra was the picture of Victorian elegance, regal, poised, and impossibly well-dressed. But behind the lace and diamonds was a peculiar private habit that baffled even her dressmakers. She intentionally wore shoes that were too small, painfully, visibly, impractically small. Not because they fit, not because they had to, but because she believed that forcing her feet into undersized shoes helped train elegance. And so she hobbled. Footmen watched her wince down marble hallways. Attendants noticed the careful way she shifted her weight during long events, always favoring one side, then the other. Her cobblers were instructed not to adjust the sizing, only the shape. One of them once whispered that Alexandra didn't just want tight shoes, she wanted them to hurt, as though beauty was something to be earned through suffering. This wasn't a passing phase. She kept it up for decades, convinced that tiny, pinched feet conveyed a kind of royal delicacy, even as blisters formed, even as her posture suffered. And though doctors quietly advised more reasonable footwear, she refused. When pressed, she would smile and say that her shoes were perfectly adequate, though her limp told a different story. Her legacy includes fashion reforms, hospital work, and a genuine warmth admired by the public. But for those closest to her, the small shoe obsession remains a lasting symbol of a woman who bore discomfort with pride, and who defined grace as something you conquered rather than wore. Yet if Alexandra's flaw was forgetting comfort, the next royal suffered from the opposite, an inability to remember anything, even the names of people in his own family. 20. Prince Albert Victor, Eddie. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, known to his unfortunate friends and deeply worried tutors as Eddie, was a man born into royal privilege but not, it seems, into mental clarity. The eldest son of Edward VII, and second in line to the throne for most of his short life, Eddie had every advantage: the best education, extensive travel, expert advisors. What he lacked, however, was a working memory. His forgetfulness wasn't just inconvenient, it bordered on alarming. He routinely forgot names, even of close relatives and key members of his household. At official functions, he would greet the same guest twice, sometimes within minutes, offering the same bland pleasantries as though encountering them anew. Courtiers developed a kind of code to steer him gently toward recognition, dropping helpful hints like, "Your uncle, sir," or "the bishop you met yesterday." But Eddie would often just smile vaguely and move on, leaving a trail of baffled aristocrats in his wake. At one event, he introduced the same person to the same group 3 times in a single evening, each time with full confidence that it was a new introduction. Another time, he mistook a prominent cabinet minister for his riding instructor and asked if the man had brought the horse round. He hadn't. There were whispers, of course, about Eddie's intellect, his isolation, his inability to retain even basic court etiquette. But in public, he was simply brushed off as gentle, kind-hearted, and delicate. And yet, if Eddie's mind was a foggy library of misplaced names, the next royal was far more physically chaotic, insisting on climbing out of palace windows just to surprise people on the lawn. 21. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll. Princess Louise, the rebellious daughter of Queen Victoria, had all the makings of a modern royal misfit. Sharp-witted, fiercely independent, and increasingly bored with the suffocating rituals of palace life. But while her artistic talents and progressive views made her a darling of the public, Those who worked behind the scenes were often left exasperated by one of her most consistent and bizarre habits, her refusal to use doors like a normal person. Louise, for reasons never fully explained, developed a personal tradition of climbing out palace windows. Occasionally first floor, sometimes higher, just to reappear suddenly on garden paths, balconies, or drawing room terraces to surprise friends, servants, and occasionally visiting heads of state. It wasn't mischief exactly. It was more dramatic flair. She loved entrances. And nothing made an entrance like stepping through a flower bed in full court dress, breezing in with a smile and the vague scent of crushed ivy. There were consequences. One lady-in-waiting fainted when Louise appeared out of the shrubbery unannounced. A footman once dropped an entire silver tea service after seeing the princess descend from a bay window in heels. The queen was reportedly not amused. When questioned, Louise simply said she liked unpredictability. Doors were for people with nothing interesting to say. She, on the other hand, had opinions, scandals, and more than one rumored affair to keep her image in delightful chaos. But if Louise defied gravity and etiquette for the sake of novelty, the next royal flirted with danger in a far more reckless way, racing horses at night while intoxicated, with injuries as predictable as the sunrise. 22. King John. If medieval kings were graded on wisdom, restraint, or long-term planning, King John would have flunked out before his crown even touched his head. History remembers him mostly as the sulking tyrant who lost the crown jewels in a swamp, got bullied into signing the Magna Carta, and was so disliked that no future king ever dared take his name. But beyond the politics and infamy, John had another lesser-known talent, finding the dumbest possible way to risk his life in moments of pure personal idiocy. One of his favorite pastimes? Drunken night rides, on horseback, through forests, without guards, and frequently at speeds that alarmed even the most hardened soldiers. Racing full tilt through uneven terrain by torchlight wasn't just foolish, it was practically suicidal in an era without helmets, decent lighting, or anything resembling a functioning medical plan. More than once, he fell off. More than once, he limped for days. Once, he reportedly tore through a hedge and landed in a pigsty. The pigs were not impressed. His advisors begged him to stop. His knights tried to intervene. At one point, someone even tried hiding the saddles. He found them, and rode anyway. It wasn't about glory or strategy. It was about proving, perhaps to himself, that he was still in control of something, even if that something was just a horse, a flask, and the dark. The king, at night, alone, daring the world to kill him before anyone else could. And while John's recklessness left him bruised and covered in mud, the next royal on our list went for something slightly more flammable, choosing, in a moment of freezing impatience, to roast chestnuts inside his coat pocket. 23. Prince William Henry, Duke of Gloucester. Prince William Henry, Duke of Gloucester, was not the brightest ember in the royal fireplace. The younger brother of King George III, William was known less for statesmanship and more for a kind of earnest, bumbling foolishness that would have been endearing, if it hadn't been so frequently hazardous. The most notorious example? The time he tried to roast chestnuts in his coat pocket. It was winter, cold, damp, and typical of the English countryside. The Duke, impatient for warmth and too privileged to wait like everyone else for a proper fire, apparently came into possession of a handful of chestnuts, raw, hard, and distinctly unroasted. Most people would seek out a hearth. William Henry, however, decided to innovate. He slipped the chestnuts into his coat pocket, sidled up close to a roaring fireplace, and stood there, perhaps imagining himself both efficient and clever. What followed, naturally, was a mixture of popping, hissing, and a rapidly escalating scent of scorched wool. The chestnuts began to roast, yes, but so did the lining of his coat. A footman had to intervene, patting out the smoldering pocket, while the Duke reportedly muttered that it had been going rather well. This wasn't a one-off moment of bad judgment. William was known throughout the court for his peculiar decision-making. He once tried to order beef in a pastry shop and, when corrected, insisted they were practically the same thing. He confused military commands. He called ambassadors by the wrong country. Still, he always carried himself with oblivious confidence, as if burning through his own wardrobe were the mark of forward thinking. But if William flirted with fire in the name of convenience, the next king wandered into chaos for a much simpler reason. He just couldn't understand the language, and once ended up completely lost in London because of it. 24. King George I. When King George I ascended the British throne in 1714, he brought with him a royal entourage, a deep mistrust of his English subjects, and a minor logistical problem. He barely spoke a word of English. This wasn't just inconvenient. It was an unbroken obstacle that colored his entire reign with a fog of misunderstanding, awkward silences, and, in one particularly memorable instance, total geographic disorientation. George was German, born and raised in Hanover, and though he ruled Britain for over a decade, he never bothered, or perhaps never managed, to learn the language of his new realm beyond a few ceremonial phrases. Most of his communication was filtered through translators, hand gestures, or long-suffering ministers pretending they understood his guttural grumbles. But one day, without a translator in tow, George decided to take a ride through London, alone. No one's quite sure where he intended to go, possibly a hunting estate, possibly just a change of scenery, but what is known is that he got lost. Hopelessly, utterly lost, unable to read the signs, unable to ask for directions. At one point, he attempted to communicate with a stable boy using broken French and loud pointing, which led the boy to direct him into an entirely different burrow. He spent hours wandering the city, unrecognized by many, confused by most, before a guard finally recognized the royal seal and escorted him back. When asked what had happened, George shrugged it off, perhaps embarrassed, perhaps oblivious. But the episode wasn't just a comedic misstep. It was a perfect symbol of his reign. A king wandering through a kingdom he didn't understand, unable to speak to the people he ruled. And yet, even a king lost in translation wasn't as startling as the final figure on our list. A queen who, in her youth, believed that the pinnacle of comedy was hiding behind doors and scaring elderly relatives out of their wigs. 25. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, young. Long before she became the stately matriarch of the British monarchy, the beloved Queen Mother draped in pastels and pearls. Young Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had a mischievous streak that made the palace staff tremble. Her favorite pastime wasn't embroidery or polite tea drinking. It was ambushing people. Yes, the future queen consort found immense joy in hiding behind doors, curtains, and occasionally large flower arrangements, just to leap out and startle whoever wandered by. Servants, visiting dignitaries, elderly uncles with weak knees. No one was safe. One courtier wrote that walking through the halls of Glamis Castle in her presence was like strolling through a haunted house, but posher. It wasn't just the act, it was the timing. She had a predator's patience, waiting sometimes 15 minutes crouched behind a drapery for her chosen victim to shuffle innocently past. Then, boo, and off they'd go, clutching pearls or teetering backwards in full Edwardian panic. She cackled. They recovered, sometimes. During one country house visit, she managed to frighten a bishop so badly he spilled his tea down his robes and called her a spirited little demon. She was delighted. To her, it wasn't cruelty, it was comedy. And in fairness, she often laughed hardest when the joke was on her. This prankster phase never quite left her. Even decades later, as Queen Mother, she retained a mischievous sparkle in her eye, a flicker of the girl who once found joy in jumping out of wardrobes for laughs. But the image of a future queen hiding behind doors tells us something strangely human. that even royalty, with all its rules and rituals, sometimes produces a child who just wants to make people scream, for fun. And so, we end with the giggle in the hallway, the startled gasp, and the lingering absurdity of a monarchy defined not just by power, but by the profoundly idiotic things its members chose to do when no one was watching.